Jeff is just, like you say, a bit of an arsehole at
Yeah.
work. What possibly is driving Jeff to be like this?
We can all think about those difficult people at work. I have some very specific examples of people who I can remember who are like, that person is basically just an asshole. Like, there's no other way to describe it. It could be that he has needs that are going unmet. So Jeff has some very specific needs that he needs to be met. And if those needs are not met for him, then he's going to behave in a way that maybe is inappropriate. Maybe he bangs his fist on the table if he's not getting the attention that he needs. Maybe he is undermining people because he has this need to progress and he's kind of throwing other people under the bus because he wants to progress in his career. Now, if you've created an environment where people feel safe, that they can say, and it's not about saying you're an asshole, it's about saying this is the impact. So you're taking the person out of the role. Yes, their behavior contributed to it, but it's not them as a person. It's this kind of specific behavior is having this specific impact on the team. And I think if we can be open about those things, and not many people, I think, are brave enough to say those, but when they are, then it makes a huge difference to the person receiving. I think it makes a huge difference to the team in how that person is showing up. The person who's giving the feedback has this aha moment of, I can really do this. I can give that feedback and it can land and it can have a positive impact as well.
That is Aoife O'Brien, host of the award-winning Happier at Work podcast and author of the upcoming book, Thriving Talent. Today, she's going to explain why some people may be just difficult at work.
Because here's the awkward truth. If you've got a difficult person on your team, you might be the one that made them that way.
Hello and welcome to Truth, Lies and Work, the award-winning podcast where behavioural science meets workplace culture, brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. My name is Leanne. I'm a chartered occupational psychologist.
My name is Al. I'm a business owner.
And we are here to help you simplify the science of work.
So today we're asking, what if the difficult people in your workplace aren't broken, but your environment is? Aoife's going to reveal the 3 universal needs that, when unmet, turn good people into workplace nightmares.
She'll also explain why psychological safety isn't about being your authentic self, why the lone genius might be costing you more than they're worth, and the 1-minute daily practice that could transform your team culture.
Plus, Aoife and I nerded out about Silicon Valley, about parks and recreation, and she's also even managed to squeeze in the Batman quote about people who just want to watch the world burn.
We'll see you after this short break.
So my name is Aoife O'Brien. I work with global organisations on helping them to create thriving organisations. That's all based on my own personal experiences at work and my quest to uncover what those things are that may be causing unhappiness at work. My business is called Happier at Work. I'm famous for having a podcast called Happier at Work, an award-winning podcast now at this stage. And I'm also, as you mentioned, have a book coming out called Thriving Talent.
One of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about was working with difficult people. Now, I've got in my head that if you're a difficult person, you're a difficult person to work with. But I sense you've got a different take on that somehow.
And you know what? I probably would have agreed with you previously, Al, if you had said this to me. And one of my previous podcast guests, his name is Zach Mercurio, he sort of, every time I speak to him, he sort of challenges me on how I think about things. And so in one of our first conversations, he challenged back and he said, because we can all think about those difficult people at work. I have some very specific examples of people who I can remember who are like, that person is basically just an asshole. Like, there's no other way to describe it. Or if we're talking UK, we might say arsehole, dare I say. Now, what Zach said is there's no such thing as a difficult person. It's the environment that we've created for them. So rather than labeling someone as being difficult, it's taking a step back and thinking, what environment have we created for that person in order to behave that way? And to me, this links back very much with what I talk about, which is one of the core pillars in my Thriving Talent framework, which is this idea of drivers. And there are things that drive us at work, and they can be positive or they can be behaviours that derail us as well.
So let's talk about these drivers then. So let's take a fictitious person. So his person we're going to call Jeff. Jeff is just, like you say, a bit of an arsehole at work. What possibly is driving Jeff to be like this?
It could be that he has needs that are going unmet. So Jeff has some very specific needs that he needs to be met. And if those needs are not met for him, then he's going to behave in a way that maybe is inappropriate. Maybe he bangs his fist on the table if he's not getting the attention that he needs. Maybe he is undermining people because he has this need to progress, and he's kind of throwing other people under the bus because he wants to progress in his career. And, you know, these are the kinds of behaviours that can undermine us as people. If we take a step back and say, well, we have universal needs. This is all quite academic-y, but we do have 3 universal needs: the need for autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And those basically mean, for autonomy, we have a sense of choice and control over what we do and how we do it. Relatedness is feeling of connection with our colleagues. But beyond the connection with colleagues, it's understanding the impact that our work has. And that could be the impact on internal stakeholders. It could be the impact on what the organization is trying to achieve. It could also be the impact on clients. So what kind of results are our clients getting from the work that we're delivering to them? And then the third universal need is competence. So that's feeling capable of doing your job. We will come back to these needs in a second, but let's maybe talk about Jeff. So maybe Jeff is not receiving any feedback on his performance. People are not saying to him, hey, Jeff, you know, you're doing a really good job. This is the difference that you're making. And he could be acting out to try and get attention or to try and get focus on his work because he has a need that's unmet. Dare I add to this mix this idea of self-awareness? And I think we all think we're more self-aware than we are. And it's really important for us as individuals to seek out feedback, and also as individuals or as leaders to receive that feedback as if it's a gift. Someone is trying to help us and to modify our behavior so that we can be successful, however, you know, whatever success means to us.
The way you described there, Jeff might be banging his fist on the table because he's not getting recognition in other areas. Makes me think of a toddler in a cereal aisle in a supermarket acting out and throwing himself on the floor. Is it as simple as actually some of these things is almost like childlike, that you need this stuff at work?
Yeah, and a lot of the things that we don't get are from childhood. So I'm not an expert in this area, but I've gathered research from other experts to look at, well, what are some of these drivers? One of the drivers that could be both positive and negative, it's something called Kahler's drivers. This is something that is in us from a very, very young age. It's the behaviors that we learn. And so it's things like be perfect, like I have to be perfect, which means I'm setting incredibly high standards for myself. But not only for myself, I'm sharing those really high standards with other people. And my expectations of other people are really high. Now, on the positive side of things, if I have that as a driver, then I'm going to be driven for excellence, and I'm going to be really attention focused, really have that attention to detail focus when I carry out my work. But at the same time, I could be procrastinating. I could be, stopping myself from going for opportunities because I don't feel I'm capable, because I'm not perfect in it. So that's one area. So there's the be perfect. There is hurry up. So maybe you received the message when you were younger. Can you do that faster? Can you hurry up? What's taking you so much time? We take all of this stuff on board. And again, this is something that has come up on the podcast multiple times, that we are kind of like those children when we're at work and we trigger each other with these kinds of things. So if you receive a message at work, or if you have the internal driver hurry up, and you have this tendency to want to get things done really quickly, and someone else is being really slow, that's going to trigger something in you that, like, why can't that person just hurry up? And you almost turn into the message that you received when you were younger. This is the evidence that I've gathered from other people, and and the conversations that I've had on the podcast to say it is very much like we go into child mode, especially. And I think from what I've seen, it's when those needs we have go unmet. So we have these drivers within us, but we also have these needs. So maybe I have a need for achievement. I have a need for stability. And if those needs are frustrated or unmet or thwarted in any way, then it's going to cause behavior. And we may not even know that this is happening. This is not something I think we deliberately do. Coming back to Jeff, does Jeff know that he is being a bit of an arsehole? Or is this the perception of other people or, a group of other people? Is Jeff self-aware? Is he seeking out feedback on his behavior? Is he aware of the impact that he's having on other people? And I think, again, coming back to this idea of self-awareness, we all think we're much more self-aware. And some people, I had this conversation not on the podcast, but someone said that he was dealing with someone and he was like, he was the most self-unaware person I've ever met. And he's receiving this feedback to say your behavior needs to improve, your performance needs to improve. And he was not taking it on board.
With your framework, does it give us a way to identify exactly what is driving Jeff to this bad behavior?
Maybe not Jeff specifically, but for people who are reading it, there are those 3 universal needs that I mentioned. And beyond just having that need satisfied, so the need for autonomy, it's about finding the balance. So it's not just saying, here's, if you remember to the early days of the pandemic, here's a whole load of autonomy overnight. It often causes people to flounder a little bit because they need a certain level of direction and guidance in order to flourish. So if they're left to their own devices, they're expending a lot of energy trying to figure out what the hell am I supposed to be doing here? And if leaders can provide that level of guidance, then that really, really helps. So it's finding that balance. It's further complicated because each individual will have a different set point, let's say, of what it is that they need in terms of levels of autonomy, in terms of it might change as well at different stages in their career. If they take on a new role or a new project, maybe they need a little bit more guidance. And I think as leaders, we're so aware of not being the micromanager that maybe sometimes we can take our hands off a little bit too much and leave people to sort of flounder a little bit and figure things out on their own. So coming back to this idea of whether Jeff might know, I think Jeff specifically, maybe he's not aware, or maybe this book will help him to become aware of what those internal drivers are. So we have the universal needs, but then we also have unique needs that we all need to be satisfied. And so reading through, I don't have a specific test, but I know that other people do have a specific test that you could take to really understand what drives you, what motivates you at work, and uncovering for yourself what that is and trying to understand, well, where do I feel really frustrated at work right now? And oftentimes where we feel frustrated or where we feel like I can't do my best work here, it's often related back to a need that is going unmet. And so it might be awkward to talk about needs at work. So we can talk about like what's blocking you or what's causing you frustration. Like, how can I as a leader help you to do better work, rather than trying to help people to understand what their needs are, which might be a little bit too much. And this is proven. This is all research backed. DC and Ryan talked about this, I think, I don't know. I don't remember the year, but it was quite a while ago. And they found that, beyond things like money, which is not a universal need for everyone, recognition is also not a universal need, which I found strange because I really like to be recognised and I assumed that everyone liked to be recognised at work. But it's those 3 are the universal needs. And then we each will, in addition to those, have unique needs that we have that need to be met. And then we'll have other things that are driving our behavior as well.
So the plan is that as a manager, I'm trying to ensure that all of my team have these 3 universal needs met, and then each one might have individual needs. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you think back, like I relate this back to, do you remember, this is probably showing my age, but Coca-Cola put people's names on the bottles. And so Coca-Cola has my name on a bottle and I want to go and pick up a bottle of Coke that has my name. And in Ireland, they did have Aoife, by the way. So, they were very focused on those individual markets as well and what were the popular names and things like that. And I think it's the same in the workplace. There's no blanket one size fits all. It happens in relationships between 2 people. And that means the relationship between the leader and the employee and understanding what it is that really lights them up. I don't imagine anyone listening to this podcast wants to create friction, wants to create an environment where people can't thrive. They want to cause misery in their teams. I'm sure people are very much focused on creating that positive environment where people can do their best work, where they feel really fulfilled, where they want to stay in the team and have a really kind of great sense of camaraderie within the team as well.
Is there a way for me to understand what's not being met? Which one of these 3 is not being met in some of my team members?
I think it's really about asking those questions. So let's take micromanagement as an example, because I think it's, dare I say, and you can let me know whether you agree with this or not, but it's a big fear that a lot of people have that they don't want to be that micromanager. So first of all, as leaders, we can look at our own behaviors and our own standards. Like, do I want to control everything? Do I want to check things before they go out? Like, that can be perceived as micromanaging behavior. And therefore, you might be perceived as a micromanager. But we can also have those conversations with our teams, with our team members individually, and describe the intent behind our behaviors. So if I want to make sure that things are checked, and if I think of my own situation now where I have the podcast and I have team members working on the podcast, and there are some things that I need to check and some things I don't. And I do try and describe the reason. And I want to check this, and I'll check this 10 times until you understand more about the nuances that I'm looking for that is really hard to explain in a document. And once we've got through 10 and you understand a little bit more about what I'm looking for, then you're off on your own and I completely trust you to deliver. So describing the intent behind that as well, but also having an open conversation. Like, I don't want to be a micromanager, and saying that out loud. For the individual receiving that message, it might be really hard for them to say, but you are a micromanager, or this is what I perceive as being micromanaging behaviors. But I think, one of the foundational aspects of the model is creating an environment of psychological safety where people are free to speak up and share what's going on for them without fear of repercussions. And I think this is kind of the key. So if someone shares, I think you're being a micromanager, and if you lose the plot because of that, then they're not likely to share what's going on for them again. So it's about taking, again, this idea of feedback, taking that feedback on board and saying, thank you for sharing your perspective. And, let me go and either make a plan in the moment or take that on board and say, I'm going to reflect on this and share back what I'm going to do differently so that I'm not perceived as this micromanager.
So you mentioned before a particular individual need, which was to be perfect.
Yeah.
So if we take the micromanager, there's potentially, I'm amateur psychologizing here, which I shouldn't because my wife is a psychologist, so she could have actually done this. But amateur psychologizing that perhaps this person might have always been told that they've got to be perfect. They might have been felt left out of decisions when they were younger, so they really want to be involved in that decision right now. So we have this micromanager who isn't responding to the feedback that you're micromanaging. What's our next step? This is a tough question.
It is a tough question. I think having been in that situation myself, having been micromanaged. So very early in my career, I felt like I was being really micromanaged. I was also being compared to other people who had, at that stage, I was pretty much straight out of uni, and other people had 5 years of experience under their belt already. And I was being compared directly to them. Now, I didn't know any better because I was new into the workplace. And it's only looking back now, 25 years later, I can see those kinds of behaviors and how they were materializing. If I think of a more recent, so like kind of in the last 15 years or so, someone was micromanaging me. Again, I don't know, did I have the language? I certainly didn't have the confidence to speak up and say, listen, you're micromanaging me here. I probably complained and complained and complained to everyone except for the person who really needed to hear it. But if I had given that feedback and said, this is my perception and the behavior doesn't change, to me, that indicates that that person is not really willing to take on board feedback. So there could be two things at play here. So either it's a personality conflict and the intention behind the behavior is good, they haven't maybe articulated the intention very well, or it's just this person is not self-aware, they're not going to change, and I need to get out of this situation.
So if you were to go back to slightly younger Aoife, who was in this situation where she was being micromanaged, is there anything that the slightly more experienced Aoife might say which could have fixed that problem back then?
Really good question. And I think I was so fixated on blaming myself at the time. So like, how did I get myself into this situation? What did I do wrong? But also looking externally to the company, what should the HR team be doing? What should the leaders have been doing? But I hadn't considered the perspective of 15 years older Aoife going back and saying, okay, what would I do? I have been asked recently about things I might change. And one of the things that I might change in that situation, because I became that petulant child that we were talking about, I was being micromanaged and I gave back. And, I had my headphones in, which at the time you would never really do that. And I was just being quite rude, but I felt I was giving as good as I was getting. So I would say, not the best approach to create an environment, for camaraderie and for productive work. And I think for me, at the time, I felt like I was doing everything I could. So I had a conversation with the leader who had told me that I was going to have that position. So there's a bit more of a story behind this. So I was told I was going to get that role. My colleague was promoted to be my boss, but it wasn't actually communicated to me. So I went and I spoke to the leader who had told me that I was going to get the promotion, and he was quite spineless. He wasn't really handling anything. He told me, your new boss is more your supervisor. If you want anything, you go to his boss. And then I thought, well, then what's the purpose of this middle layer between me and my actual boss, this supervisor layer? I think looking back now, I would, and it's hard for me to say this because these conversations are hard, but have an open conversation about what's actually going on. Explain to him, because he may not have known that I was promised that position. He may not have known how his behavior was being perceived as well. And yeah, just getting it out in the open so that we could hammer through it. And the perspective that it's me and him against this problem, as opposed to me against him, which I think is oftentimes our default mode. Like, I need to attack this person because they're doing something against me, as opposed to we need to work together to try and solve this problem.
We've learned that difficult people aren't necessarily born. They can be created by environments that fail to meet three universal needs: autonomy, relatedness, and competence. We've heard about Jeff banging his fist on the table, toddlers throwing tantrums in supermarkets, and why childhood patterns show up in our conference room. After this short break, Aoife's going to reveal what she believes drives unhappiness at work And I'll ask Aoife the question the entire psychology world has been seeking an answer for. Why is Guilfoyle from the TV show Silicon Valley such a difficult person to work with? See you in a sec.
I've got a brand new team. There's 15 people in the team. I'm a new manager. I'm kind of like approaching it fresh. Then do I start with, is it as simple as starting with the foundation of psychological safety?
Yeah. So when I did my own research when I was doing my master's a number of years ago, and that's where let's say the seed of this model came about. So I looked into, really I was looking at engagement, but deep down what I wanted to understand was what drives unhappiness at work. Why are we so unhappy? And so the model came about because I found that values and values alignment and alignment between our personal core values, which I didn't even know that we had until I did this research, and the values of an organization, which most people know that we have because it's in your emails or it's posted on your wall or whatever it might be. And then needs satisfaction. So our needs need to be satisfied at work in order for us to feel engaged and happy. And then the last one was abilities and our abilities to do the job. And so it's evolved since then. The language has evolved, but also psychological safety was a huge missing piece that I realized comes up again and again in conversations on the podcast and conversations I have with teams. So psychological safety is that foundation. And so when we're building psychological safety, I think we assume as a leader that I feel psychologically safe to share with my team and to speak up with my team. But do you feel psychologically safe to challenge above you? Do you feel psychologically safe to challenge your peers? And just because you feel safe with your own team, it doesn't necessarily mean that they feel safe to speak up to you because you're the boss. And they may need some help in understanding that it's okay to speak up, to share, to challenge the status quo. They need to see that modeled by you. They need to see you modeling that you don't have all the answers, that you're looking for input. And we really need to start there with creating that psychologically safe environment. I was lucky enough to see Amy Edmondson speak live and get a copy of her book, The Fearless Organization, and just, how she uncovered this. And then I think it was popularized by Google. It's just really fascinating. Google were trying to find what makes the difference between maybe an average team and an exceptionally good team. And what they found was the missing ingredient is psychological safety, that people are okay. They feel safe to speak up, to challenge the status quo, to challenge how things are doing, to improve processes. And they're not afraid that someone is going to laugh at them, that someone is going to tear them down, that they're going to say your idea is no good. Or in my case, I was told in one organization I worked in, that's not how we do things around here. It's having that openness to be challenged on how things are actually done.
So there's a great series. Well, there's a series I really enjoy called Silicon Valley, and
you've got me. Yes, I love it.
Right. I want to talk about Guilfoyle for a second,
just
to give context if no one's seen it. First of all, you're a fool for not watching it because it is brilliant. But secondly, Guilfoyle is this really difficult person to work with, but he is absolutely incredible at what he does, and perhaps his difficultness also makes him great.
Yeah.
I'd be concerned that if I'm trying to make him more agreeable at work, it's going to stop him being such a genius at what he does. Am I being stupid here?
So, first of all, highly commend the Silicon Valley mention. I love that show. I think I got into it during the pandemic and just binged. I highly recommend people go and check out that show. And you've inspired me now to go and rewatch it because I just thought it was so genius. Let's come back to this idea that psychological safety. So Amy talks about this in her book. She talked about it in her speech. People confuse psychological safety with being nice all the time. It's not about creating an environment of being nice. It's not about creating an environment where people feel comfortable. It's about creating an environment where people feel safe to challenge what's going on. In the case of Guilfoyle, he is a genius, and this goes for any organization, and I've seen it firsthand where people are fantastic salespeople And they get rewarded because they're bringing in new clients, they're turning over high revenue, but they're really terrible with people. They're leaving a trail of destruction, whether they're trampling over people, they're getting favors that they're not repaying, whatever it might be. That's bad for business in the long term, because if you're creating that kind of toxic environment where you're rewarding people simply because they are bringing in more money, then you're showing to everyone on the team, this is what's important here. It doesn't matter if you treat people badly. And that's, in the long term, not good for business, because people will leave, the morale will be low, people are not going to give discretionary effort if they don't feel like they're going to be rewarded for doing things the right way, let's say. So back to Guilfoyle. Is he impacting detrimentally on other people in the team? Or, it's the argument, and maybe it depends on the team. But I think most people these days will argue that you don't just have one star in the team. It's about how people cooperate and do things together and bring out each other's areas of genius, rather than just having a sole operator who's doing absolutely everything. And in the series, he built a server by himself, and he did all these crazy things that no one probably knows how to do. But coming back to this idea that it's not about the single person, it's about the cooperation that we have with other people. And I'm trying to think, did he have a negative impact? I know that he had this kind of sparring relationship with one of the other guys. His name goes out of my head right now. But he had that sparring relationship. But was that part of the fun for both of them? Or did he have a negative impact on other people? And if he had a negative impact, then again, it's about having this conversation. It doesn't have to be comfortable. It has to just feel safe, that it's okay for me to say this to this person.
Let me ask you, how can we tell if we're the difficult one in the room?
A couple of points here, and stealing from Bob Sutton's book, Robert I. Sutton, his book, The No Asshole Rule. And he says, if you look around and you don't see any other assholes, then you could be the one who is the asshole. It comes back to what we spoke about earlier, Al, this idea of feedback. And I think oftentimes we're afraid to ask for feedback. And it might give a shiver down our spine if someone says to us, I have some feedback for you, or the thought of asking for feedback might be really difficult because you're afraid of what people might tell you. But we have to get feedback from people in order to A, build our self-awareness, and B, progress in however we want to progress. So if we want to progress in our career, if we want to move up the ladder, if we want to improve our performance, we have to get that feedback. Now, if you've created an environment where people feel safe, that they can say, and it's not about saying you're an asshole, it's about saying this is the impact. So you're taking the person out of the role. Yes, their behavior contributed to it, but it's not them as a person. It's this kind of specific behavior is having this specific impact on the team. And I think if we can be open about those things, and not many people, I think, are brave enough to say those, but when they are, then it makes a huge difference to the person receiving. I think it makes a huge difference to the team in how that person is showing up. The person who's giving the feedback has this aha moment of, I can really do this. I can give that feedback and it can land and it can have a positive impact as well. So I think if you suspect that you might be that difficult person, be open to feedback, seek out that feedback. Maybe you have an inkling, again, going back to the micromanager type of culture, like, am I being the micromanager? Seek out that feedback and be very specific. If we're thinking about feedback, again, thinking on a conversation I had recently on the podcast, and one way that he described asking for feedback was, I thought it was brilliant. Rather than saying, have you got some feedback? Which most people would be like, oh, feedback, that's hard to give. That's awkward. And no, I don't have any feedback for you. But if you ask someone to rate your performance, and it could be performance in a very specific area. It could be on a project. It could be whatever. Rate your performance. Now, how likely are they how likely are they to say 10 in that situation? Not likely. They're much more likely to say something like 7 or 8 or even 6. And in that case, you can say, okay, so what would bring me closer to a 10? So from a 6 to a 7, from a 7 to an 8, from an 8 to a 9. And that is a way to get feedback without asking for feedback. I thought that is genius. But also he added to that, rather than asking for people for feedback, ask them for advice. People love giving advice. What would you do in this situation? Or what would and people will tell you. They won't necessarily give you feedback if you ask for feedback, but they will certainly give you advice if you seek out their advice.
Now, where does the manager's responsibility fall there? You don't want to be meddling with home life, do you?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And I don't think I've ever really thought about that. So if we think about autonomy, like, do I have a sense of choice and control over what I do and how I do it? Is that mired, let's say, by the fact that you have kids and your time is sort of taken up by doing things that you enjoy doing, but you feel like you're a bit more under pressure. Competence, maybe you're having doubts about your abilities as a parent, and this is causing issues as well. It's not to diminish that those things are going on, but I think if we go into work and those things are being met to some degree at work, or we could have the mentality that I want to overcompensate in some way because these needs are not being met. So I'm a really terrible parent, and therefore I'm going to go into work and I'm going to be like, and I think of maybe this is not quite for you, Al, but there's an episode of Sex and the City where Miranda is like, she's trying to balance everything. She's trying to be a really good mom at home and she's failing there, and she's trying to be a really good lawyer, but because home life is taking up so much time, she's being perceived as failing in the office as well. But we may try and compensate in some way by kind of overdoing it in the work environment if one of those needs at home is not being met. So if we feel constrained from an autonomy perspective, that may show up, that may present itself as now I need to make sure everything is under control. Or it could result in I want to have more freedom at work. So I'll perceive any sort of people, coming to me trying to control my time in any way, that's them micromanaging me.
So let's talk about the book. What was your favorite chapter to write?
So that's an interesting question, because before I wrote the capabilities section, I was like, I can't wait to dive into all of this. And it's about productivity, which I love and I've been talking about for years. And it's about, understanding people's strengths and unleashing people's strengths, which is something I feel we don't talk enough about at work. I mean, we don't talk about any of these things really at work, but strengths is something I think if we can get that right, if we can get people working in roles that really match their strengths and pair them up with people who have complementary strengths, I think that makes a huge difference. But when I sat down to write it, maybe I was putting so much pressure on myself that it just became a bit of a chore. And I was like, is this really hanging together? It feels a bit dry in places. And so what I was really looking forward to didn't really come together in the way that I had planned. The very first chapter that I wrote was the one that just flowed out of me because I had so much to say about it. That was all about drivers and specifically the universal needs, because that's what I did. All of my research on was understanding what my master's research about 6 years ago now. I did all of that research on self-determination theory, which was DC and Ryan's theory of motivation about understanding what these needs are and how they need to be met. So there's kind of two answers to that. There was the one I was really looking forward to that was a bit like, oh, this is harder than I thought it was going to be, because I'm so interested in the topic. I wanted to make sure everything was kind of really flowing in the right way. And probably I had so much to say about it that it made it hard, versus the one that just flowed out of me.
One of the reasons for someone being difficult at work, it's just occurred to me, they might have all of these three fundamental needs met, but they're just perhaps neurodivergent. And that might be a reason why they appear to be difficult at work. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I haven't done research on this. And so I'm not an expert in the area, although I do suspect that I may be neurodivergent myself. And I think when we're neurodivergent, we are more aware of these things and more interested in a sense of fairness and a sense of justice in the world. And so when that happened, when I was in that role and I was passed over for promotion, I got really pissed off. And I was like, this is not fair. Why did this happen? And the sense of rejection was really strong. And so that could be something that's driving us, because there are so many people who thought, you're crazy to leave that role. You're being sponsored here. You know, do you not want to stay in this country? Like, all of these things came out. And I was like, I'm not interested in those things. I'm not happy here. And I've been shafted in a way. And so I'm going to leave. But I just felt this sense of injustice, and I want to make things right. And maybe that's what's driven my whole business and driven me to write this book. But there could be specific needs, or people could be perceived in different ways. So let's take Guilfoyle as the example. Like, he's a genius, but he's very kind of focused. And I don't want to give him a label, but could he potentially be autistic? And how he relates to people is not necessarily how they feel. They don't feel that sense of connection with him because of how he relates. And this sense of connection is one of our universal needs. It's one of our fundamental needs. And either from his perspective, maybe he doesn't feel connected to others, or they don't feel connected to him, because how we connect with each other or what that means could be different for different people.
I am fascinated by characters on TV, particularly in a workplace setting. There's a guy called Ron Swanson.
Yes, I know of Ron Swanson. Yes.
Ron seems to delight in being a difficult person at work.
Ah.
Are there just people who just love being that arsehole at work?
That's such a good question. And I'm trying to think. I certainly have known people, and I'm trying to think, what is that driver? What's that unmet need that person has? Was their family life difficult when they grew up? Are they retaliating? Are they, what is going on? And maybe there are people. And again, I think hammering home this point, but come back to self-awareness. What is the impact that you would like to have at work? And if you're the kind of person who wants to create misery and conflict and make things difficult for other people, then you're doing a really good job of that. If that's not your intention, and you're unintentionally creating conflict, or you're creating difficulty, or you're just making people's lives a misery, but that's not really what you want to achieve, or maybe that's all you know, or maybe you associate that with, that's just who I am. And touching on this idea of psychological safety, it's not about just being who you are at work. Tomasz Chamorro-Premuzic, he talks about it's not being your authentic self and bringing your full authentic self to work. It's about bringing your professional self to work. So having psychological safety is not an excuse to show up just as I am. It's about being professional and courteous and respectful. So coming back to the Ron Swanson example, self-awareness, how am I coming across? Can I ask for feedback? What is the impact that I'm having? And there could be people who genuinely are driven by that. Like, is he driven to hurt other people for some reason? And is that, again, not getting too psychological here, but is that psychopathic or sociopathic or something that people just want to cause damage? And thinking about a Batman quote here where Alfred says, some men just want to watch the world burn. And maybe that is the case. But do you want that person in your work environment?
So it comes out in March 2026. Someone reads the book and they only implement one thing from it. What do you want that one thing to be?
Can I cheat and have two things?
You may.
We talked about psychological safety. So I think making sure that you have that and checking whether you have that. And an example, again, this is from what a guest shared with me on the podcast. Robert Glazer talked about, how do you know whether you have psychological safety? You ask people to do outrageous things. Outrageous. It's going to cost way too much in budget. It's unrealistic from a time perspective or a quality perspective. And you see what they say. And if they smile and they nod, then you know that you do not have psychological safety, that they're not pushing back. So I would say psychological safety, if you assume that you have it, maybe check whether you have psychological safety at work. The other thing for me is it's kind of maybe one of the easier things to do and to build in. And it's not additional time. It's just letting people know, it will take a minute, maybe 2 minutes, the impact that their work, their day-to-day work is having on the team, on the department, on the client, whatever that looks like, but just giving them that feedback, making that connection obvious for them. The work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis is having this positive impact on our goals, on our objectives, on the client, whatever it might be.
Okay, so that was Aoife O'Brien. And if you like her stories, then definitely check out our podcast, Happier at Work.
I'd like to wrap up with our 3 takeaways for leaders. Lesson 1, there's rarely such a thing as a difficult person. Usually unmet needs are the culprit. Aoife says everyone has 3 universal needs: autonomy, that's choice and control; relatedness, connection and impact; and competence, which is feeling capable. When these aren't met, people can act out, like toddlers in supermarkets. Lesson 2, psychological safety isn't about being your authentic self at work. It's about being your professional self. And here's how to test if you actually have it. Ask your team to do something outrageous. If they smile and nod instead of pushing back, you probably don't have psychological safety. And lesson 3, Aoife says you should take 1 minute, literally 60 seconds, to tell someone the impact their work is having on the team, on clients, on goals. That simple connection between daily work and meaningful outcomes can transform how people show up. And if you've got that lone genius who's brilliant but bordering on toxic superstar, Aoife's challenge is simple. Calculate the cost, the damage, the turnover, the culture erosion. Is it really worth it?
You can find Aoife's award-winning podcast, Happier at Work, wherever you get your podcasts. And her book, Thriving Talent, comes out in March 2026 at thrivingtalentbook.com.
You can also connect with her on LinkedIn, Aoife O'Brien. That's Aoife, O'Brien spelt with an E. And tell her you heard her on Truth, Lies and Work.
Remember, if you've got a difficult person on your team, the question isn't necessarily what's wrong with them. The question might be, what environment have we actually created?
That is all for today. This is Truth, Lies and Work. We will see you next week.